She had heard those words before, spoken so evenly, it took her years to understand how much damage they were doing beneath the calm. You are not her daughter, not anymore. And she had answered them the only way a child raised in that house knew how to answer them. I was born in this house. But being born somewhere, she would learn far too late, is not the same as being wanted there. 22 years later, she stood outside those same iron gates again, and the man watching the entrance did not recognize her face. The family isn't receiving visitors today, he told her, polite and firm. She told him she didn't need to be received, that she used to live here. He apologized, said he didn't know who she was. She almost let herself laugh at that. 22 years ago, she told him quietly, this house couldn't stop talking about her. The gate did not open, not yet, but she wasn't leaving, not this time. Her name is Vivian Calloway, and for over 2 decades, she has watched from a distance, while another woman lived the only life she was ever supposed to have. She has watched her walk the same gardens, sit at the same table, and answer, every single time someone says it out loud, to a name that was never hers to borrow. Vivian did not fight for any of it back then. She simply left, quietly, carrying one suitcase and a piece of her mother's jewelry, and she let the world believe whatever story it wanted to believe about why she was gone. What nobody outside that house has ever understood is why a woman with every right to stay chose instead to disappear without a single word in her own defense. Something happened inside those gates that convinced Vivian leaving was safer than staying, and for 22 years, she carried that decision like it was hers alone to make. She rebuilt an entire life 2 states away, under a different name, and told almost no one the truth of where she came from. The people who knew her best during those years would tell you she never once mentioned Newport, never once mentioned a family fortune, and never once gave any indication that she had left behind anything worth going back for. Now she is back, and the questions that follow her up that driveway are the same ones that will follow you for the rest of this story. Why did she really leave? Why has she chosen this exact moment to return, decades after everyone assumed the matter was long settled? And what she is actually after may not be what anyone, including the woman wearing her name, is prepared for. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly what was taken from her and exactly what she intends to do about it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what Vivian Calloway lost, you first have to understand what Thornefield was before any of this began. The estate sat on Newport's Ocean Drive like a monument to a family that had built something real, 3 stories of stone and salt-worn windows facing the Atlantic, the kind of house that made strangers slow their cars just to look at it. Vivian's father, Edmund Calloway, started with 1 leased dry dock and a stubborn refusal to fail, and by the time Vivian was born, Calloway Maritime Holdings had grown into one of the most respected shipping operations on the eastern seaboard, with contracts that stretched from Boston Harbor to the ports of Charleston. Edmund did not raise his daughter to admire that success from a distance. He raised her to understand it, to walk the docks with him on Saturday mornings before the crews arrived, to ask questions about tonnage and contracts most children would never think to ask. Edmund believed and said often enough that it became something of a family motto, that a company built on someone else's back would eventually collapse the moment that person stopped carrying it, and that the only inheritance worth leaving behind was one the next generation actually knew how to run. By 12, Vivian could read a shipping manifest better than most of the men Edmund employed to manage them. By 18, she was sitting in on board meetings, not as a courtesy, but because her father genuinely wanted her opinion in the room. Vivian was not simply an heiress waiting for a fortune. She was a daughter being quietly prepared to run one. Edmund's first wife, Vivian's mother, died when Vivian was still young, From an illness the family rarely spoke about even among themselves, and for a while, it was just the two of them in that enormous house, learning how to be a family of two. The household staff during those years remember a very particular kind of quiet. Not sad exactly, just careful, the two of them figuring out together what their life was going to look like now. Vivian's memories of that period are some of her clearest and some of her most protected. Vivian's mother, Eleanor, had been the one who first fell in love with Thornefield, long before Edmund's shipping business made the estate a fixture of Newport society rather than simply a large house on a quiet stretch of coastline. She had planted the rose garden along the east wall herself, a detail Vivian still thinks about every time she walks past it, and she was the one who insisted Vivian learn to sail before she learned to ride, arguing that a girl who understood the water would always understand her father's business better than one who didn't. Eleanor's death left a particular kind of quiet in that house, one Edmund never fully replaced, no matter how warm the years with Margaret initially seemed. When Edmund remarried, he brought home a woman named Margaret, and for a long time, the marriage looked like exactly what everyone hoped it would be. Margaret was warm at dinner parties, generous with compliments, the kind of stepmother neighbors described as a blessing to a grieving family. She learned Vivian's favorite meals, attended every school event without fail, and for the first several years, there was nothing in her behavior that gave anyone reason to look twice. It took years before anyone close to the family noticed how differently that warmth behaved once the guests had gone home, and even longer before Vivian let herself notice it too. The first real signs were small enough to explain away. A comment Margaret made once, almost offhand, about wanting family who really belonged at Thornefield, aimed just slightly past Vivian rather than at her. A tone that shifted depending on who else was in the room, warm in front of company, clipped the moment the door closed. The estate's longtime housekeeper, a woman named Dolores Vance, who had worked at Thornefield since before Vivian was born, noticed it too, though she never said so directly to anyone who might repeat it. Vivian told herself it was nothing, the way people often do when the alternative is too uncomfortable to sit with. She kept working alongside her father, kept learning the business, kept believing that whatever tension lived quietly under Margaret's charm would eventually resolve itself on its own. Then came Renata. She arrived at Thornefield when Vivian was in her early 20s, introduced as a distant cousin on Margaret's side, brought in to help out after what the family called a hardship no one explained in much detail. Vivian remembers liking her immediately. Renata was easy to talk to, quick to laugh, unfailingly curious about the business Vivian loved talking about, and the two women discovered early on that they were close enough in height and coloring that people occasionally mistook them for sisters at a glance. For a while, that resemblance was treated as nothing more than a pleasant coincidence, the kind of thing people mention once at dinner and forget by dessert. Looking back, Vivian can point to the moments that should have told her something was already being arranged around her. A family portrait, commissioned the year Renata turned 22, where Margaret, without much explanation, asked Renata to stand at the center while Vivian was placed toward the edge of the frame, close enough to technically be included, far enough to barely register at a glance. A birthday where Vivian received something practical and useful, a leather portfolio for company documents, and Renata was given a piece of jewelry that had belonged to Vivian's late mother, presented so casually that objecting to it would have seemed petty rather than reasonable. At the time, Vivian let each of these moments pass without comment, because raising them out loud felt smaller than what was actually happening, and because she genuinely liked Renata and did not yet understand that liking someone and being quietly replaced by them were not mutually exclusive. Vivian's 25th birthday became, in hindsight, one of the clearest markers of how far the arrangement had already progressed. Edmund had planned a formal dinner at Thornefield to announce Vivian's promotion to Vice President of Operations, a title he had been preparing her for since she was old enough to sit through a full board meeting without fidgeting. Margaret handled the guest list herself that year, and by the night of the dinner, Vivian noticed that several board members greeted Renata with the same warmth and familiarity typically reserved for family, lingering conversations that lasted longer than politeness required. Vivian mentioned it once to her father afterward, framing it as a joke about Renata's easy charm. Edmund did not laugh. He simply asked her, quietly, to be careful about which rooms she left Renata alone in. By the time Edmund's health began to decline, the quiet arrangement inside Thornefield had already been building for years, long before anyone said a word about succession out loud. Everyone in that house understood that the future of Calloway Maritime Holdings was coming to a decision point, and that Edmund's plans for it had never wavered publicly from naming his daughter. Edmund understood it most of all, and in the last stretch of his life, he began asking, more insistently than he ever had before, to see his daughter alone. Those requests, and the way they were quietly managed, would end up mattering more than anyone at Thornefield could have predicted. If you're already invested in Vivian's story, drop a comment letting us know what you think really happened behind those doors, and if you haven't already, now's a good time to hit subscribe so you don't miss how this one unfolds. Edmund's decline, once it started in earnest, moved faster than anyone at Thornefield was prepared for. The man who had spent 40 years walking the docks before sunrise was, within a matter of months, confined to a bedroom on the second floor, his voice thinner each week, his world narrowing down to the four walls of a room that had once been his wife's sewing room. Vivian moved back into her childhood room during those months, determined not to lose a single day she still had with her father. What she did not yet understand was that every one of those days was already being managed by someone else, in ways she would not fully see until it was far too late to change anything. Edmund asked for Vivian constantly, and specifically, in a tone that made clear this was not simply a father wanting his daughter nearby. He asked to speak with her alone, without Margaret in the room, without Renata hovering near the door with tea neither of them had asked for. He would say her name twice sometimes, as if repeating it might make the request carry more weight. Each time, there was a reason the visit needed to wait. He was tired. He had just taken his medication. The doctor had asked for quiet, and surely Vivian didn't want to be the reason her father's condition worsened. Vivian noticed the pattern eventually, but by then, she had also been told, gently and repeatedly, that her presence upset him more than it helped, that perhaps it was better for everyone if she kept her visits shorter and less frequent. She believed it, because believing it was easier than believing the alternative, and because the people telling her this were the same people she had trusted her entire life. There was one afternoon Vivian would return to again and again in the years that followed, a moment she did not fully understand until much later. She had come to see her father unannounced, earlier than her usual visiting hour, and found Margaret already in the room, speaking to Edmund in a low, even voice that stopped the instant Vivian's footsteps reached the door. Edmund's eyes had found hers immediately, wide and urgent in a way that did not match the calm reassurance Margaret offered a moment later, explaining that they had simply been discussing paperwork, nothing that concerned Vivian, nothing worth worrying about. Vivian left the room without asking a single question, and spent years afterward wishing she had asked all of them. She would later learn, far too late to change anything, that the paperwork in question that afternoon was the very codicil Edmund was trying to have witnessed before Margaret found a reason to delay the signing until it was no longer possible at all. When Edmund died, the reading of his will named Vivian Calloway as the primary heir to Thornefield and to controlling shares of Calloway Maritime Holdings, exactly as everyone in that house had always assumed it would. The document was dated, notarized, entirely in order, read aloud by the family's longtime attorney in a study lined with the same nautical charts Edmund had collected his entire life. What almost no one thought to notice at the time was how little that document actually said about who Vivian Calloway was. No photograph attached to the file, no fingerprint, no detail beyond a name and a birth year, because who, in a room full of people who had watched a little girl grow up in that house, would have thought such details were ever necessary? Over the following 18 months, something began happening at Thornefield so gradually that no single moment of it looked like a decision. Margaret began introducing Renata to members of the company's board, first casually, at dinners, then more formally, at meetings Vivian was somehow never quite well enough to attend. Staff who had only known the family's adult children in passing, or not at all, began greeting Renata with the same name they had always used for the daughter of the house. Social circles in town, most of whom had known Vivian only as a private, reserved young woman, rarely seen at public events, simply accepted the woman in front of them as exactly who she was introduced to be, because nothing about the introduction gave them a single reason to question it. One board meeting in particular would later stand out to Vivian as the moment the arrangement stopped being informal and became something closer to official. Renata attended that quarter's shareholder review in Vivian's place, introduced by Margaret simply as Vivian Calloway representing the family's interests, and not one of the 12 people in that room, several of whom had done business with Edmund for over a decade, asked a single clarifying question. Minutes from that meeting, which Vivian would later obtain during her own research, list her name 11 times, attached to remarks she never made, motions she never seconded, and a company direction she had no part in shaping. Vivian, meanwhile, was told a story about herself that she had no real way to check. She was told that her father's death had affected her more visibly than she realized, that people were starting to worry, that her presence at company functions was doing more harm than good to a business already grieving its founder. A family doctor, one Margaret had personally recommended years earlier, gently suggested that some time away from the pressures of the estate might do Vivian good, framing rest as care rather than removal. She was told this by people she trusted, in rooms where no one else was present to contradict it, until isolation began to feel less like something being done to her and more like a decision she was making on her own behalf. Renata, for her part, did not experience those 18 months as a triumph. Colleagues who worked near her during that period would later describe a woman who seemed perpetually careful, memorizing details about a childhood that was never hers, rehearsing anecdotes Margaret fed her about Vivian's early years so she would never be caught unprepared at a dinner party. She kept a private notebook, discovered only much later, filled with names of Vivian's old teachers, the names of household pets long since passed, the specific way Vivian had once described her mother's laugh, all of it committed to memory, the way an actor learns a part she is never allowed to stop playing. There were nights, according to that notebook, when Renata wrote simply that she did not know anymore where the performance ended and she began. By the time Vivian actually left Thornefield, no one had thrown her out. There was no argument loud enough for the staff to overhear, no scene dramatic enough for the neighbors to discuss. She packed one suitcase, took the sapphire brooch that had belonged to her mother, because it was the one thing in that house Margaret had never thought to take from her, and walked out believing, entirely on her own, that leaving was the responsible thing to do. Dolores Vance, the housekeeper who had known Vivian since infancy, was the only person who cried openly at the door that day, though even she did not fully understand what she was watching. Vivian thought she was protecting her family. She had no idea she was disappearing from her own life. For the next 22 years, Vivian built a life that had nothing to do with Thornefield, and for a long time, that distance felt less like loss and more like relief. She took her mother's maiden name, settled 2 states away in a quiet coastal town far smaller than the one she had left, and started a small interior design business that grew slowly but honestly, built on nothing but her own reputation and her own hours. She made real friends who knew nothing about shipping fortunes or family estates, people who liked her for reasons that had nothing to do with a last name. She learned to sleep in a house with thin walls and ordinary furniture, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not miss the size of the rooms she had grown up in nearly as much as she expected to. There is a version of this story where that quiet, ordinary life was enough, and for years, Vivian genuinely believed she was living it. She dated occasionally, built her client list one referral at a time, and allowed the version of herself that had once walked board meetings at Callaway Maritime Holdings to become something closer to a memory than an identity. What never fully left her was a single, unresolved question she rarely said out loud, even to the people closest to her. She had walked away from Thornefield, believing she was doing the right thing, but she had never actually understood why doing the right thing had required her to disappear entirely, and why no one had ever once asked her to reconsider. Her closest friend during those years, a fellow small business owner named Grace Alden, who ran the flower shop 2 doors down from Vivian's design studio, would later say she always sensed there was a chapter of Vivian's life she kept the door closed on. Grace never pushed, and Vivian never offered, and for most of 2 decades, that arrangement suited them both fine. There was one night, years before the letter ever arrived, when Vivian sat in her car outside her own apartment for nearly an hour, having typed her father's company name into a search bar and then closed the browser without pressing enter. She was not ready yet. She would not be ready for another several years. That question stayed folded quietly into the back of her life until a letter arrived, more than 2 decades later, from a law firm she barely remembered her father ever mentioning. The letter was signed by an attorney named Nathaniel Pierce, a name Vivian did not recognize, explaining that a routine review of the Calloway estate, prompted by Margaret's declining health, had uncovered a codicil to Edmund Calloway's will that appeared never to have been executed. Attached to the letter was a single handwritten line, copied directly from Edmund's own hand, that stopped Vivian cold the moment she read it. Everything he had written was to go to his daughter Vivian, and no one styled in her place. He had known. Somehow, in his final year, he had known enough to write those words down, and to find a way to make sure they survived him. What followed was not a police investigation, and never became one, because nothing about this story belonged in front of a judge. What followed was Vivian, on her own, beginning to quietly reconstruct 22 years of her own erased history, one conversation and one document at a time, working the way a person works when they are trying to understand their own life rather than build a case against someone else's. She started with Dolores Vance, the housekeeper, retired now and living modestly outside Providence, who remembered Renata's arrival far more clearly than anyone at the time had ever let on. Over 2 long afternoons of tea and careful memory, Dolores described small details Vivian had never known, including how quickly the resemblance between the 2 young women had gone from remarked upon to actively encouraged, with Margaret once asking Dolores directly whether she thought Renata photographed like family. Dolores had not known what to make of the question at the time. She understood it perfectly now. Vivian found old social pages and company newsletters next, years of them, pulled from library archives and stored digital copies, and laid them side by side across her dining room table. The woman photographed as Vivian Calloway aged differently across those years than Vivian herself had, smiled differently, stood differently in photographs at company events Vivian had never once attended, holding herself with a formality Vivian never once used in her own life. It was strange, she would later say, to watch a stranger wear your own aging face back at you across 2 decades of paper, to see your own name captioned under someone else's posture at 100 different events you were never invited to. She had the sapphire brooch appraised next, mostly out of curiosity at first, and learned something that finally gave her the thread she needed. The piece Margaret had always described as part of the Calloway family collection, handed down for generations, had actually been purchased new, decades after the family history it was supposed to belong to, according to the jeweler's own maker's mark and a sales record still on file. It was a small detail, a piece of jewelry rather than a legal document, but it was the first piece of Margaret's careful story that came apart the moment someone actually bothered to check it, and it gave Vivian a strange, steadying kind of confidence that everything else Margaret had ever told her might come apart the same way. Beyond the housekeeper and the old newsletters, Vivian also requested access to years of internal company correspondence through Nathaniel Pierce, records she was legally entitled to as a named heir under review. Buried in emails between Margaret and the company's longtime accountant, she found repeated references to transition documentation and continuity records dated years before Edmund's death. Bureaucratic language that, once Vivian understood what it actually described, read less like routine paperwork and more like a plan being built one quiet approval at a time. For a stretch of weeks, Vivian allowed herself to believe the worst possible version of Renata, that she had orchestrated the entire scheme willingly and without a second thought about the woman she was erasing. She rehearsed conversations in her head where she said all the things she had never gotten to say and told herself she was owed the right to be angry at both women equally. That belief did not survive contact with what Vivian found next, tucked inside an old family archive she was legally entitled to request as part of the estate review. The diary filled in details Vivian had never known about the cousin she once considered a friend. Renata had grown up in a household 2 states away that Margaret rarely spoke about directly, one marked by financial instability, and, according to a few careful lines Renata never elaborated on further, a stepfather whose temper made staying difficult and leaving nearly impossible without somewhere else to go. Margaret's offer to bring her to Thornefield had arrived, in Renata's own words, like being pulled out of water. I didn't know how much longer I could tread. Reading it did not erase what Renata had ultimately allowed to happen. It simply complicated a story Vivian had spent 22 years imagining as far simpler than it actually was. Before she ever drove to Newport, Vivian did one more thing, quietly, without telling Nathaniel Pierce beforehand. She attended that year's Calloway Maritime Holdings shareholder meeting, open to the public in a way most people never bothered to notice, and sat near the back of the room under her mother's maiden name, watching Renata deliver an address about quarterly earnings in a voice that had, over 2 decades, learned to sound almost exactly like the voice Vivian remembered using herself at that age. No one in that room recognized her. She was, in every practical sense, a stranger watching her own inheritance being presented to a room full of people who had no idea the wrong woman was standing at the podium. She stayed for the entire meeting, took no notes, and left before the closing remarks, having seen enough to know exactly what she was walking back into. By the time Vivian had gathered enough to be certain of what had happened, working late into the evenings with Nathaniel Pierce reviewing documents by phone, she made a decision that surprised even him. She did not send a formal notice. She did not have papers delivered to the gate through a process server. She got in her car, drove the 2 hours to Newport alone, and stood outside the same iron gates she had walked out of 22 years earlier, because whatever came next, she wanted to look the people inside that house in the eye when it happened, the way she had never been given the chance to the first time. The reunion between Vivian and Renata happened, in the end, without shouting, in a hallway neither woman had expected to be standing in that day. 2 decades had changed both of their faces in ways the old photographs never quite prepared either of them for, small lines and gray threading through hair that had once been identical enough to fool a room full of strangers. For a long moment, neither spoke. It was Renata who finally said what both of them were thinking, that she had wondered, more times than she could count over the years, what she would say if this day ever actually came, and that she had never once landed on an answer that felt honest enough to use. Vivian did not answer with anger, though she had every right to. She answered with a question instead, asking simply how any of it had started, and whether Renata had ever really had a choice in the matter, or whether choice had been taken from her too, in a different room, at a different age, long before Vivian ever noticed anything was wrong. Renata's silence in response to that question said more than anything she could have offered in words. The dining room itself had not changed much in 22 years. The same long table, the same view of the Atlantic through windows Edmund had insisted on keeping unshuttered even in winter. Vivian noticed, sitting down across from the 2 women for the first time since she was 26, How much smaller the room felt now than it had in her memory, and how strange it was that a space capable of holding this much unspoken history could still just be a room with a table in it. Margaret took her usual seat at the head, out of habit more than authority, and for several seconds no one reached for the water glasses in front of them. Margaret's version of events, when it finally came, was delivered at the same dining table where a family portrait had once been rearranged to push Vivian toward its edge. She did not deny what she had done. She reframed it instead, calmly, the way she had reframed every uncomfortable truth for 30 years, insisting that Renata had simply been steadier, more suited to public life, more capable of carrying a family name without cracking under it the way Margaret privately believed Vivian would have. She insisted that sending Vivian away had been a mercy dressed up as something crueler than it actually was, a decision made, she claimed, entirely out of love for a stepdaughter she feared was not built to survive the pressure of her own inheritance. It was, in its own way, the most honest thing Margaret had ever said inside that house. And it was also the exact moment her calm finally stopped working as proof of anything except how long she had been willing to lie, both to everyone around her and, perhaps, to herself. What Margaret did not say at that table, though Vivian would piece it together later through conversations with people who had known her longer, was that her own first marriage, decades earlier, had ended when a stepdaughter from that household contested an inheritance Margaret believed she was owed, a bitter dispute that cost her both the marriage and the money. Whatever Margaret told herself about protecting Thornefield, some part of her had spent 30 years determined never to lose that particular fight twice, even if winning it this time meant making sure Vivian never had the standing to fight back at all. The full truth surfaced through Edmund's own final year, once Nathaniel Pierce tracked down a second, duplicate copy of that handwritten codicil, one Edmund had mailed months before his death to an old business partner and family friend, a man named Arthur Bellamy, specifically so it could not be quietly buried inside Thornefield. Bellamy, contacted for the first time in years, produced the sealed envelope Edmund had asked him to keep untouched, unless something ever happened to the original. In his last months, weak and increasingly aware of what was being arranged around him behind the closed door of his own sick room, Edmund had understood enough to know his daughter was being written out of her own life, and his final act, carried out in secret and at considerable personal effort, had been a quiet attempt to undo it from a room he could no longer safely leave. Arthur Bellamy insisted on delivering the sealed envelope in person rather than through a courier, driving 3 hours from his home in Mystic, Connecticut, because Edmund had asked him, all those years ago, to place it directly into the hands of whoever eventually came looking for the truth, and no one else. He was in his 80s now, and he told Vivian, sitting in Nathaniel Pierce's office with the envelope still unopened on the table between them, that Edmund had called him twice in his final months, both times sounding like a man trying to solve a problem he no longer had the strength to fix on his own. Bellamy had kept his promise for over 20 years without ever knowing exactly what he was protecting. Watching Vivian finally open it, he said, felt like watching an old debt finally get paid. Renata's own admission, when it finally came, was not the confession of a woman defending a lie she still believed in. She admitted plainly, sitting across from the woman whose name she had worn for over 20 years, that she had spent every one of those years afraid to stop pretending, because she had never been entirely sure who she would be allowed to become if she ever set the name down, or whether the family that had built her a new identity would simply discard her the moment she stopped being useful in it. It was not an excuse, and she did not offer it as one. It was simply the truth of what it cost to build an entire adult life on ground that was never actually yours, comfortable and familiar as that ground might have looked from the outside for over 2 decades. For the first time in this story, Margaret sat at that table with nothing left to reframe. There was no version of events remaining that made her the protector of anything, and for a woman who had spent her entire adult life ensuring she always had one, the silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Once the duplicate codicil was verified through Arthur Bellamy's records and cross-checked against Edmund's original handwriting by an independent examiner, Vivian's reinstatement as heir to Thornefield and to Calloway Maritime Holdings was handled quietly through the family's own estate attorneys without a single public hearing or a headline anywhere in Newport. That was always the kind of resolution Vivian wanted. She had not come home looking for a spectacle or for the kind of public reckoning that would turn her father's legacy into gossip for the rest of the town to pick over. She had come home because her father's actual wishes deserved to matter more than the 22 years someone had spent quietly overriding them. The board of Calloway Maritime Holdings, informed of the verified codicil through a private letter from Nathaniel Pierce rather than any public announcement, accepted Vivian's reinstatement without objection, and several longtime members, the same people who had once greeted Renata as Vivian without a second thought, requested private meetings with Vivian in the weeks that followed, less out of obligation than out of genuine curiosity about the woman whose name they had unknowingly misapplied for over 20 years. Vivian granted a handful of those meetings, answered their questions plainly, and made clear she had no interest in punishing people for believing what they had every reasonable reason to believe. What surprised the people around her most was not that Vivian reclaimed what was hers. It was what she chose to do once she had it. Rather than treat Renata as an enemy to be removed and forgotten, the way almost anyone in her position might have, Vivian offered her something closer to an exit than a punishment, a real identity of her own for the first time in over 2 decades, along with a modest settlement that would let her build an honest life somewhere far away from Thornefield's long shadow, under a name that had never belonged to anyone else. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was simply Vivian recognizing, after everything she had uncovered, that Renata had been a tool in someone else's plan long before she was ever a willing participant in it, and that punishing her further would not undo a single year either of them had lost. In the months that followed, Vivian returned to Calloway Maritime Holdings, not as a figurehead, but the way her father had always intended, walking the docks before sunrise, the way she had as a girl, learning which contracts had shifted in 22 years and which crews still remembered Edmund well enough to trust his daughter on reputation alone. She made no announcement framing her return as a triumphant reclaiming of anything. She simply showed up, asked the same kinds of questions she had always asked, and let the work itself answer whatever doubts remained among people who had spent 2 decades calling someone else by her name. Margaret's ending was quieter still, and in its own way, more fitting than any dramatic downfall could have been. She remained at Thornefield, but in a diminished role, no longer the one deciding who belonged in which photograph or which name got spoken at which table, no longer consulted on the business her husband had built or the household she had once controlled, down to the smallest detail. For a woman who had spent 30 years controlling every version of the truth that reached the people around her, simply losing the pen was its own kind of consequence, quieter than a courtroom and, in the end, harder to live inside. When word reached the household staff that Vivian had been formally reinstated, Dolores Vance was the first person Vivian called, before Nathaniel Pierce had even finished the paperwork. Dolores did not say much on the phone that day, only that she had waited 22 years to hear something like this and had genuinely begun to believe she never would. The younger staff at Thornefield, most of whom had only ever known Renata as the lady of the house, adjusted to the truth with the particular calm of people who had simply been waiting for someone to finally tell them what they had quietly suspected for years, that something about the household's history had never quite added up. The final image of Vivian in this story is not one of triumph so much as one of quiet arrival. She walks the same halls she grew up in, past the same portraits, past the very spot where that family photograph had once been rearranged without her notice, and finally stands in a house that recognizes her exactly as she is, without correction, without hesitation, without anyone at the door asking who she claims to be. What this story leaves behind is a harder question than most inheritance disputes ever raise. It asks what it actually means to be erased by the very people who were supposed to protect you, and what it cost to spend 22 years being quietly convinced that disappearing was your own idea all along. If it took your own family 22 years to finally admit the truth, would you still want to go home? There is no version of this story where Vivian gets back the 22 years she lost, and she has never pretended otherwise to herself or to the people who ask. What she got instead was something smaller and, in its own way, harder won, a house that finally says her real name out loud, a company that finally answers to the right hands, and a father's last written wish, however long it took to reach her, finally honored exactly as he intended it. In the weeks that followed, Vivian did one small, deliberate thing before anything else. She took her mother's sapphire brooch, the one piece of Thornefield that had traveled every mile of her exile with her, carried through a decade of ordinary apartments and an entirely different name, and returned it to its original place inside the house, not locked away in a safe this time, but simply back where it always belonged, in plain sight. It was a small gesture, but for Vivian, it meant something larger than jewelry ever could. It meant the story finally had an ending she had chosen for herself, rather than one that had been quietly written around her by people who never once asked what she wanted. Renata left New England entirely within the year, settling somewhere Vivian deliberately chose not to ask about, under a name she was finally allowed to choose for herself, rather than inherit from someone else's plan. The two women exchanged one final letter before that, brief and without much sentiment, in which Renata thanked Vivian for a mercy she admitted she had not expected and likely would not have offered in Vivian's position. Vivian kept the letter in the same drawer where she now keeps her father's handwritten codicil, two documents that, together, tell the only version of this story that ever actually mattered. She kept the design business, though she runs it now from Newport, close enough to walk the docks her father once taught her to read, and far enough from the house itself that Thornefield remains a place she visits rather than a place that defines her. Dolores Vance, well into her 80s now, still comes by for tea most weeks, and the two of them have never once needed to discuss what happened in detail. Some things, once understood, don't need to be said again. We'll leave you with the same question Vivian had to answer for herself. If you were in her position, walking back up that driveway after 22 years, would you have come back at all, or would you have let the past stay exactly where it was, undisturbed, on the other side of a gate you never had to open again? Let us know in the comments what you would have done, and where you're watching from tonight. If this story moved you, stay close, because there are more stories like Vivian's still waiting to be told, and we'd hate for you to miss the next one. Don't forget to subscribe.